human condition. And we have to explore how we can still live in peace in spite of all the things that challenge us. Some would talk about inner peace as an important definition of peace. Many would say that's where it starts, that I have tranquility with myself, a tranquility of my mind. And because I have that, I can move on to outer peace. Fraternal peace is an interesting concept. As I'll come back to soon, that's actually part of Alfred Nobel's will, that we should create fraternity between peoples. What does fraternity mean? Does anyone have a definition of fraternity? Well, you have a fraternity, I know you have those. This involves no alcohol. Or marijuana. What's fraternity? Brotherhood, right? I mean, most of us prefer to say brother and sisterhood, but many of these concepts come from times when things were always put in male terms. So it's this sense of family, this sense of being people who wish each other well. Chip here has done great work on the Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. And the very first line there speaks about us as a family. Isn't that a fantastic thing? That's the thing you want to do after the catastrophe of the Second World War, the nuclear bombs, the Holocaust. We have to reconfirm that we are actually a family. And that's the concept of fraternal peace. We mean each other well. I think many of us today would say that an important part of peace is peace with our planet. Peace with other forms of life. Peace with the climate on which we are all dependent. And that is also an important part of how we create peace in the world. And then, of course, you have the religious concept of divine peace or harmony with God. The Nobel Peace Prize at least addresses the first one, negative peace. It addresses fraternal peace and addresses environmental peace. But it's an open question to what extent it also is connected to the ideal of a positive peace and also an inner peace. And we certainly have recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize who have been driven by an idea of divine peace. That was the introduction. Now comes the lecture. Go. There is Alfred Nobel. There is hardly a single picture of him smiling. Sorry about that. He was a Swede, so that may have been the reason. Any Swedes here, sir? My wife is half Swedish, so as well. You know what? We have these Nobel medals in chocolate. So I always wear some in my pocket during the Nobel ceremonies. And I tell them before we enter City Hall to walk in, and everyone is really nervous. I take the chocolate medal out and I say, if you lose it up there on stage, just come to me, I have this. No one can see the difference. And they all laugh, and then we walk in because everyone's really nervous. So Alfred Nobel was a Swedish industrialist famous for inventing dynamite. He was a rich man, arguably, we don't know this for sure, the richest man in the world at the time of his death in 1896. Alfred Nobel had no children of his own and not that much immediate family, so he decided to give all of his money away to a fund, the interest of which would be put into international prizes. So that's the background of the Nobel Prize. We don't have a close and serious analysis from himself or why he chose the exact prizes he did choose. One of them, of course, was the Peace Prize. But there is a lot of speculation that this was a way for him to atone for the fact that so many of the things he had invented were essentially ingredients in weapons of war. They say that a few years before he died, his brother passed away. And there was an obituary in a newspaper where they had been mistaken. They thought Alfred Nobel was dead. And the headline ran, "The Merchant of Death is Dead." And according to stories, Alfred Nobel was deeply saddened by this. Is this how I am to be remembered? And that may be one of the reasons why he came up not with just these prizes, but the Peace Prize in particular. If you go to the Oxford dictionaries online, including the Oxford Dictionary of Contemporary History, the Nobel Peace Prize is simply defined as the world's most prestigious prize. You may quarrel with that because there are many prizes around the world, including, of course, the other Nobel Prizes. But I think if you look at the sort of press and attention it gets, that is probably a fair definition. As I already said, it comes from the will of Alfred Nobel. His last will was dated in 1895, in which he enumerates 5 prizes. An additional prize was added in 1969, but it's not really from the same money, and it's not called officially a Nobel Prize, but a prize in the memory of Alfred Nobel. Okay, let me ask you, does anyone know any of the prizes apart from the Peace Prize? Just shout out, yeah?
Economics, literature,
Yeah.
and chemistry.
Chemistry. Physics, right. And one more? Literature, right. And medicine was already mentioned. There we have them all. Economics was the one that was added. The others are physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, peace, and economics. I will look more closely at the background for those, but first, we'll do a little trivia quiz, okay? Are y'all ready? Yay, okay. I will now put on this PowerPoint here some pictures of some Peace Prize laureates, and we'll see if you know who they are. And you just shout out the name. Some of them will be very well known to you, and others you'll go, who on earth was that? The first one was given out in 1901, so it's a pretty long history, and I don't know all of them myself, even though I'm trying. You know this one?
Yeah, Martin Luther King Jr.
King Jr., that's right. He received the Peace Prize in 1964 for his nonviolent civil rights work here in the United States. Famous physicist, but he didn't get it for physics. It's Andrei Sakharov, who was one of the most important dissidents in the Soviet Union, and he got it for his peaceful prize against, work against communism in the Soviet Union. He, of course, was severely punished for the work he did. Anyone knows who that is? Mother Teresa, probably one of the most striking prizes ever. Andrei Sakharov never got around to getting to Oslo to receive the prize. His wife had to go because Soviet authorities did not allow him to go because of his opposition work. Mother Teresa did come, and I remember it well. I was 13 years old at the time, 1979. It was very different because normally there's a lot of pomp and circumstance. I don't know the difference between pomp and circumstance, but I think we were both. Want some pomp there, a bit of circumstance. And then suddenly you have this nun walking up in the university hall where they had that at the time. She refused to receive the banquet in the evening because she insisted that all the money that would have gone to the banquet would instead go to the poor in Calcutta. And it was one of those prizes that's a more humanitarian prize, and we'll come back, of course, to that. Does anyone know who the guy to the left there is? I know the picture is small for those of you sitting in the back. The guy to the right is the chair of the committee at the time. The other is Bishop Desmond Tutu from South Africa, one of 3 people to have received the prize for his work against apartheid in South Africa. This one is another one like Andrei Sakharov, who did work against a totalitarian regime or an authoritarian regime.
China,
right? Liu Xiaobo. Liu Xiaobo received the prize in 2010. He was at the time jailed, and he remained in jail, and he died 2 years ago from cancer, which could have been cured, we presume, if it had not been jailed. And the Chinese authorities were extremely angry at this prize and decided to punish the Norwegian government for that, even though the Nobel Committee is independent of the Norwegian government. Here's one of the ones that I have actually been part of from 2016. Does anyone know who that is? Once again, I know the picture is small. Maybe some of you here hail from that wonderful country. That's from Colombia, that's right. President Juan Manuel Santos, for his work in creating a peace agreement between the government and the FARC. Here we have a few more. This is one of the relatively few Norwegians to receive the prize. I don't expect that you know who he is, but he was important at his time, Fridtjof Nansen, who was crucial, not just in international diplomatic and peace work generally, but in his work to save Russians from the terrible famine that followed the Russian Revolution. Here we have an interesting one, arguably the first of the environmental prizes. His name was Norman Borlaug, and he was an American agronomist who is considered the father of what they call the Green Revolution. Some have said that he has probably saved more than 100 million lives because of his work to increase yields, not least within wheat. Not least this helped India and Pakistan in the 1960s. Here we have one of those few success stories of the Middle East, namely the peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. It's Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. Many have assumed at the time that Jimmy Carter, the US president, will also get it because he's the one who brokered the agreement. But according to what I know, he was not nominated, and if you're not nominated, you can't get the prize. You got it later. Here are two important figures, one more likely than the other. We are once again in South Africa and the anti-apartheid work, and this is
Nelson
Mandela. But who is this? That's Frederick de Klerk. That's quite right, and that's controversial to this day because he was, after all, the leader of the apartheid regime. But he was also the one who started dismantling it, and the logic behind it is somewhat of the same that gave Mikhail Gorbachev the prize for dismantling the Soviet Union. This is an important prize which hangs in the balance these days, namely the prize for the main architects between the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, which essentially ended the civil war in Northern Ireland, David Trimble and John Hume. And finally, you'll probably know who this is. Malala Yousafzai, the youngest person ever to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, who received it for work for education of these girls, alongside Kailash Satyarthi from Pakistan. And finally, we have the laureates of 2018. Does anyone know their names? Nadia Murad from Iraq.
Egypt.
Dennis Mukwege from Congo. I could say much more about them, but let's now get to the meat of what the prize is about. They received it for their impressive and truly brave work to combat sexual violence in war. I can assure you that having been together with Dennis Mukwege, I've been together with one of those persons in the world that has impressed me the most with his sort of presence, his sort of spiritual courage, and his sort of vision for you. But now we'll go to the background of the prize. It's based on the will of Alfred Nobel, which says that his money should be invested in a way to make it possible to give prizes to those who, during the preceding year, that's the part of the will we're struggling the most with. Because most people who really deserve this prize have done work over a long period of time. I mean, Susan, just take chemistry. Who gets a prize for something they did this last year? It's something that has gone on for a long time. And we try to follow this will as closely as we can, but arguably that's what makes it hardest. They shall have conferred the greatest benefit to man and womankind. We have the 5 different ones here in the original will: physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and finally, peace. Work for the fraternity between nations, for the abolition or reduction of standing armies, and for the holding and promotion of peace congresses. I'll tell you afterwards what that means. In addition, we have the Economics Prize from 1969. The prizes are to be given out by the Swedish Academy of Sciences, that for physiology or medical work by the Karoline Institute in Stockholm, that for literature by the Academy in Stockholm. Has anyone read about the Swedish Academy? If you haven't, don't. No. I have great respect for the honorable institution of the Swedish Academy and the fantastic knowledge that's there, but there was no literature prize last year because they've had a bit of a tussle and this, that, and the other, and if you like soap operas, you can read about it. But that's being straightened out now, and they're back at work. And the final one is for the Norwegian story. Why? Why Norway? Alfred Nobel was from Sweden. It's like an American saying, okay, Canada can have it. Well, the background is quite simple. In 1895, when he wrote his will, Norway and Sweden were in a political union. And probably Alfred Nobel was thinking that it's good that also the other party, the other camp, gets to hand out the prize. And also, Sweden was actually quite a big player in international politics, whereas Norway didn't have its own foreign policy at all. So he probably thought that would be less dangerous, more neutral, if this prize, which is so political, is actually handed out in Norway. I remember Paul McCartney once started a world tour in Oslo, and he was asked, why Oslo? And he said, well, it's off-Broadway. So, and I guess it was a little bit off-Broadway. So that's one way of explaining it. We We are 5 people. I've been picked by the Norwegian Storting. I don't know exactly why they asked me, but it's the different parties in Parliament that have a right to nominate. I was once active in one of those parties. I've done work, political party. I have done work on various things within international politics, so I was asked to be part of the committee. I have also highlighted here that no consideration should be given to the nationality of the candidates. In other words, it's an international global prize. So if Alfred Nobel had been from Vietnam, it would have been handed out in Vietnam. But that's not the point. It's not a Scandinavian or European prize. It's meant to be a global prize. Here we have the current committee. I'm the gray-haired man sitting there, and I cannot tell you too much about what we do during the actual meetings, because that's the statutes. I'm not allowed to tell you who is nominated or not. If you ask me if Donald Trump has been nominated, I cannot answer. I read the New York Times, and it said that Donald Trump had been nominated by President Abe of Japan with a wonderful letter. And Abe said, I cannot comment on that, and I can definitely not comment. I'm one of the 6 people in the world who knows, but I cannot comment. So you won't get any secrets from me tonight. I'm sorry. It's even being taped here, so the other members of the committee can follow this. What I can tell you, if I really divulge a little bit just for you, I can tell you that she and he drink coffee, and the others drink tea. My good friend Torbjørn Jagland here, who's actually former Prime Minister of Norway, he always uses his tea bag twice. So there. Now you're a little bit on it. I'll just show you one more picture before we get back to the substance. This is from last year's ceremony. And these are the 2 laureates, Nadia Murad and Dennis Mukwege. And if you have a chance, I'm sure it's on YouTube, to watch their speeches from last year and how they tell about the ideal of a peace that includes the vanquished in war, includes those who have been terribly mistreated and afterwards have to live with both suffering and shame for the rest of their lives. Many of those who have been violently sexually mistreated will be incontinent with smell for the rest of their lives and thus being shut out from their local communities. And these are people who address this. Dennis Mukwege is a fantastic surgeon who has devoted his life both to physically helping and to publicly tell their story. Tell a story about her. He told wonderful stories about how some of these women with no future in their lives have been built up again physically and mentally. And he said that theirs is a Nobel Peace Prize. They are the ones who deserve this prize. And they are the ones who tell us stories about the horrors of war and why we must make sure that those who commit these sorts of actions are actually taken to court and that we are shown that this is not allowed. We have to fight against this sort of weapon being used. Nadia Murad, now only 25 years old, was just less than 5 years ago captured and held as a sex slave by ISIS. Much of her family was killed, massacred. She managed to flee and decided to devote the rest of her life to fighting against this. As she says in her great book, The Last Girl, my aim is that I'm the last girl to tell this kind of story. And I think that's part of what the Peace Prize should be. It's like a flashlight, that you point towards certain ills in the world to tell the world that if we can stop this, we can create a more peaceful world, and we can defend the dignity of humans. What's the process? Well, here you have the groups that may nominate. It's small print and it's a lot of different groups, so I won't spend too much time on that. But I'll just point out, since I'm in this great university, that university professors, professors emeriti and associate professors of history, social sciences, law, philosophy, theology and religion, university rectors and university directors, or their equivalents, directors of peace research institutes and foreign policy institutes may nominate. So my friends and students, if you think of someone who really deserves the Nobel Peace Prize, you know what? I think you should knock on the door of James or Andy or Chip here or some other professors within these relevant fields and ask them, would you consider nominating this person for the Nobel Peace Prize? Because that's the way it works, that we get ideas from various people belonging to these various groups who have the right to nominate. The deadline every year is February 1st. We have meetings of the committee regularly from that time until early October. The decision itself is announced on either the 1st or the 2nd Friday of October. It's handed out in Oslo on December 10th. Many people think that's because that's the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's the International Human Rights Day. But it's because it's the day that Alfred Nobel died, and that's in the statutes. If you know how cold it is also in December, I wish he had died in July. Norway in July is really nice. Norway in July is like San Antonio in March. So it's not also, but it's nice in December. Christmas decorations and stuff. It can be given to both individuals and institutions, but it can be shared by no more than 3 parties. So that's the formal background. Let's spend my final 15 minutes on actually getting into the meat of what this prize is about. And let me do that by first asking some questions. First of all, is what Nobel calls in his will a champion of peace, someone who deserves the Nobel Peace Prize for the work they have done for mankind, the same as a pacifist? Well, the answer, if you look at the history of the Nobel Peace Prize, is no. Many, both institutions and individuals who have received the Peace Prize have been active within organizations who have also had armed forces, and many of them have not been pacifists. This is one of the questions most often comes up. So it means that it's not a pacifist prize per se, but at the same time, it has an ideal that we can solve human conflicts without the use of armed force. But I'll add to you that this is actually one of the controversies that swirl around the prize all the time. For instance, some years ago in 2012, the EU got the Nobel Peace Prize. What does the EU stand for? European Union. And the European Union is, of course, a union of states that most of them are members of NATO, and most of them, all of them, have armed forces. So should this organization, which is also active in at least aid to military operations, even though it has no military forces of its own, receive a peace prize? Several US presidents have received the Nobel Peace Prize, and that question has come up too. Should we give the prize to someone who is actually actively engaged in war? And Barack Obama touched on this very much when he received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009, and in his speech in Oslo said that you must be aware that the one you have given the Peace Prize is someone who actually believes that in some cases the use of armed force is necessary. So there's a tension here. There will be differences between different Nobel laureates. Maybe the most famous fighter for nonviolence in the world never got the Peace Prize. Mahatma Gandhi. He died in 1948 before they gave him the Peace Prize. It cannot be given posthumously. Interestingly, in 1948, no one received the Peace Prize, which was a sort of acknowledgement that Gandhi should have received it. I believe Eleanor Roosevelt should have gotten it in 1948, but that's for her work, for the UN Declaration. Then the second question is there a specific concept of peace that underlies or is expressed by the prize? You remember I talked about the challenge of relativism, that peace can mean many different things. Is there one definition of peace underlying it? No, I don't think there is. There are prizes clearly tied to what we can call negative peace, peace negotiations, disarmament, stopping a war, Juan Manuel Santos helping stop the civil war in Colombia. But there are certainly also many prizes tied to a more expansive view of peace. Education and Malala, the work for the poor of Mother Teresa. These are tied to an idea that true peace is also a peace that makes human flourishing possible, and it also facilitates meaning. There's a question that often comes up if it's tied to a Western conception of democracy. That came up when Liu Xiaobo received the prize in 2010 for peace opposition work in China. And many in the formal party circles in China said that this is the West trying to tell us how to run our country. But we are not democratic in the way you are, and you should respect that. And the Nobel Peace Prize answers, well, but we believe that the ideals he stands for furthers human dignity, and that includes the right to democratic participation. This is also, as you can see, clearly a debate. All the questions I'm asking now show that the Nobel Peace Prize will be sometimes controversial. And I think if it hadn't been, it wouldn't have been worth much. That also, of course, is tied to the question of how political the prize should be. Many here in the United States have complained that most of the times when U.S. politicians get the prize, it's a Democrat. Theodore Roosevelt got it long ago, and there is no political program behind it. But that's also controversy and debate when one is heard. And then the question about the three criteria for the prize: fraternity, reduction of armies, and peace congresses. Are they equal, or are they some way ordered hierarchically? Is one thing more important than the others? And I don't know what the final answer to that is, but we try as well as we can to live up to all of the criteria. What do they mean? Well, fraternity between nations arguably must mean that we have a sense of family, that we don't want to hurt each other, and that we have mutual obligations, the idea of humankind. Which to many can seem like an obvious idea, but it is most certainly. Just look at the history of racism in our world. Just look at the history of slavery in our world. And you clearly see that the basic idea that all human beings have the same sort of dignity and rights within a community that spans the whole world, which makes us all family, that's not an obvious idea. But it's the idea that underlies the Nobel Peace Prize because of this sentence from Alfred Nobel. Sometimes it is asked, it is only between nations. Isn't it also something that can happen between people within a nation? And I think that's true. If you look at many of the recent prizes, they have been given to reconciliation processes within a nation. The second criterion is probably the easiest one. By the way, any English teachers here? For the honor of the English teachers, I will now teach you a difference that you in this room will never make a mistake on in your papers. People make mistakes on all the time. In the singular, it's criterion. In the plural, it's criterion. I give one grade better to everyone who gets that right when I grade papers. No, I don't. But there are no criterias, right? No criterions. Are you with me? We say it all together: one criterion, two criteria. One criterion, two criteria. They learned something. Okay, back to the serious stuff. This one is probably the most easy to understand. Reduce the availability of the means to fighting violent conflict. It's not necessarily pacifist. It doesn't say the abolition of all weapons, but the reduction. The prize 2 years ago went to the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, because the Nobel Committee insists that a world without nuclear weapons is safer than one with nuclear weapons. And we in the committee know very, very well that the road there is long. I myself is a firm supporter of NATO. And I know that this will take time and that you cannot just immediately abolish all nuclear weapons here. But I think as a worldwide goal, on behalf of the Nobel Committee, we believe that it's indeed a worthy aim. And finally, it's this one, which sounds a little bit old-fashioned, because in the 1890s and early part of the 1900s, there were lots of peace congresses around the world, working primarily to create an international law that would abolish war. And they were very, very optimistic all the way until 1914. And Alfred Nobel believed, inspired by people he knew, not least the Austrian noblewoman Bertha von Suttner, that we should have more of these peace congresses. Meeting is a precondition for developing ideas. Maybe we are having a peace congress here tonight. Well, at least that's the way this is often interpreted today. Not concretely for peace congresses, but for creating arenas for developing ideas. What are the conceptions of peace that are actually expressed through the Nobel Peace Prize? Well, it's disarmament, it's negotiation to end or mitigate war. It is, in some cases, even though not always, pacifist opposition to war, plus what you can call peace education, teaching people how to think in terms of a non-violent world. Martin Luther King Jr. did that. Humanitarianism has played an important part indeed. Human rights have increasingly done so since at least the 1960s. In some cases, it's leadership in itself, statesmen and stateswomanship. Why did Barack Obama receive the Nobel Peace Prize? That was before my time, so I cannot answer directly, but you remember the controversy, right? You remember Barack Obama saying anyone gets the Peace Prize these days. Why did he get it? He had only been president when he received the prize for less than a year. Well, the idea behind it and the reasoning given by the committee is that Barack Obama is someone who has, as a statesman and a leader, introduced ideas into the world that changes the way in which we speak about questions of moral peace. Not least his approach to the Muslim world and the relationship between Islam and Christianity, and the debate about nuclear weapons. Very controversial prize at the time, still a controversial prize, but it's a prize for two people who changed the way in which we think about the world. And then I'll add at the end, environmentalism, which increasingly has become part of the way in which we speak about world peace today, and which has resulted in several peace prizes, maybe most famously to Al Gore and the International Climate. Finally, what sorts of people and institutions receive the prize? You remember the pictures I showed. What are they? Well, I think one way of thinking about them is to think about them as what some people, including the political scientist Roger Alfred, has called norm entrepreneurs. What is that? Well, that is someone who thinks, here we have something that ought to be in the world, but it's not there now. How do I work to inject this into the bloodstream of the world so that people start talking about it, thinking about it, discussing it, putting it on the table, negotiating about it? It has to start somewhere. Norm entrepreneur is someone who tries to do that. And it often goes, according to Alfred, through three stages. First, the emergence of a norm. Slavery is wrong. No one should own another human being. That was very controversial, but it was gradually accepted through a process of both dialogue and political decisions. And then gradually it becomes internalized. It becomes part of institutions, part of the way in which people think, and part of the standard of how we expect others to work. I want to ask you young people here today, what sort of norms do you hope within your lifetime will it be accepted and internalized? There are several different sorts of norms that lie behind the Nobel Peace Prizes. And there are some important distinctions between them. We have norms to make war less likely or less acceptable. We have norms to absolutely abolish war. Or we have norms to mitigate the effects of war, or to regulate war, what we often call international law. But all of those, I think, are united in the idea that there exists something we can call a global civil society, which can help us propagate these norms. And I think that's an idea that's being challenged by many today. You have also read about the emergence of more nationalism, right? Yeah. That we think that we must take care of our nation and think of ourselves first, and then others have to take care of themselves, and we're essentially in a sort of competition. I think that one of the ideas behind the Nobel Peace Prize is exactly that that's not the right way of thinking about it. That's something you have to discuss between yourselves. Finally, there is an important point when it comes to norm and norm entrepreneurship, is what comes first. Think nuclear